Welcome to the MuseCast, where we squeeze every last drop of inspiration out of Sunday's sermon.
Well, thank you for joining us for the MuseCast. I'm Shawna Boren, and that is Dan Kent. Hi, Dan.
Hello. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Did you see the episode with Osheta and I?
I did.
Remember in Wayne's World when Wayne was gone and Garth was all by himself on the screen and he was just like totally awkward? That's kind of what it was.
So bad. You are bad. You guys did great. Thank you for keeping the ship afloat. I know you like those nautical terms, Dan.
Welcome back.
Thank you. We are glad that you guys are with us today. And was it yesterday or today, the first day of fall officially, like calendar? Either yesterday or today.
It took me a couple minutes to figure out it was Tuesday. So
I know,
I'm
right?
like, that's like way off my radar.
I literally just said to Dan, oh man, this week has been, and then I go, oh wait, it's only Tuesday. So, however, it truly is the beginning of fall.
Yep.
What do you like to do? Do you like fall?
I love fall with like this giddy dread.
Yeah.
You know, it's so beautiful, but I just know what's coming.
Yep.
And so I kind of, there's like this held breath sort of feeling of it. But I love the air. It's so crisp. I love bonfires in the fall.
The smell of those are just amazing.
Yep. And you know, I have a lot of friends down south, and so do you, and they don't really understand.
They don't get fall.
They don't get it.
No.
So it's a different vibe here for sure.
Yeah, I think you and I are on the same page. I love fall, and being from the south, I never really understood it. Like I'm like, oh, fall, let's wear a sweater, but you don't really understand it.
That's right.
Until you live in a beautiful place like we do, and like there's a row of 3 trees outside my bedroom window, and they've already turned red.
Wow.
And so it's like, it's just so gorgeous. Love the bonfires, love windows open at night, just that crisp air coming in. You know, all the fall things, scarves and cider and apple orchards and. So good.
Yep, it is.
But I think the key is to fully enjoy fall. You cannot, you can't think about what's coming next. You just can't, because
it's
it'll
hard
wreck
not to.
I know.
We all have PTSD here from
We
these
do. We're
endless,
just like, oh my
endless winters.
Oh my gosh, you see a truck driving by with salt, and you're like, what's going on?
And they practice now too.
They do.
They practice with their trucks. So,
they do. So happy fall, y'all.
Yep.
All right, so this past weekend we got to hear from Sandra Unger.
Yep.
And she brought to us a beatitude, as we're continuing in Sermon on the Mount. She brought to us one of the beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers.
Yeah.
Really, really good stuff. And so Dan, talk to us a little bit about what Sandra shared with us regarding blessed are the peacemakers.
It was a great sermon. It's not like we don't really have bad sermons, I guess.
That one really stuck.
Yeah,
like,
right.
We would never.
We wouldn't say that,
No.
but it was a good sermon.
Yeah.
And so she talked about I think is this the 8th beatitude or the 7th? Well, anyway, it's blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And I don't know about you, but whenever I read the beatitudes, I think of the religious figurehead in The Princess Bride, and I always say blessed with a W. But that's a secondary point.
Right. That's for post MuseCast.
That's right. Yeah. I'm getting ahead of myself here.
Right.
That's for the post MuseCast party. But what Sandra talked about is she talked about what does it mean to be a peacemaker in this world that's so violent, and she looked at kind of the reality that we're all raised with this inclination toward violence, and we tend to downplay and minimize and even make a caricature out of violence, and that's the soup that we grow up in, and she talks about like all the violence in cartoons and how, as silly as it is, it's still kind of horrifyingly violent when anvils fall on these characters' heads and they fall off of cliffs and they light each other on fire, and so she talked about how just deeply ingrained violence is in our lives, and that we grow up in that. And so she kind of talks about some ways to kind of work ourselves out of that. She talks about, we can grow into violence, and we can think of violence as our go-to solution to whatever problem that we come upon. And in order to become peacemakers, we have to fight against that inclination. We have to outsmart that sort of code that we've all kind of inherited being born into this world. And so she talked about our tendency to want to have an enemy so that we can feel good about ourselves. And then she offered some ideas for us to kind of work ourselves out of some of these violent tendencies that we have. And she talked about resting in the reality that we don't need to have a bad guy to be good guys. We can be good even if we don't have a bad guy. And she offered some ideas for exercises for to become peacemakers. So for instance, turning off the news, finding safe conversation partners, finding quiet time, things like that. And she also talked about, and this is one of my favorite things, she talked about the importance of love relationships.
Yeah.
And she talked about the elephant and the rider kind of analogy that Greg has used from Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. And she said something really interesting that I didn't really pick up when I went through that sermon series and when I went through the audiobook, and that is really to get a person to change, reason and argument is not as effective as love relationship, because our own elephant, our own emotional brain, is less inclined to listen to our own reason. Our emotional elephant basically wants to do whatever it wants to do, and our brain's job is just to justify it. And so it's really hard to change if we're left on our own. But if there's somebody that we admire, if there's somebody that we love, if there's somebody who we care about, our elephant is inclined to listen to their rider and listen to their argument. And so what that means is that relationship is more important than reason, and being kind is more important than having good rhetorical skills. It really is about being kind and loving one another. And then finally, she just said that in order to love another person in this violent world, you have to have empathy and you have to understand their story, and you have to ask the question and live into the reality that if you lived that person's life, you would probably do the same things that they're doing. And that kind of demilitarizes our stance towards them, and it changes our perspective so that we're no longer attacking them, but we're trying to understand them and trying to figure out how would I get out of that situation if I were them. And most likely humiliating them isn't going to help.
No.
But rather understanding them and working together is a much more effective solution. So those are just some of the things that she talked about. She also talked about her new book called Tribe, which I'm really excited to read. It just came out. It's fresh off the press. And so definitely looking forward to that.
Yeah.
What did you think of it?
Yeah, I really appreciated the fact, so much of what you said, of course, great summary.
Hey, thanks.
I really appreciated the fact that she said, you know, there really are the two dimensions of peace. There is this inner peace, and then there is this outer peace. And we can't really strive for peace in the world, worldly peace, if we are in turmoil inside. So if we don't have that inner peace, then we're going to be less effective in trying to influence worldly outer peace. And so I really appreciated that. And I remember Greg's sermon regarding the elephant, and we've talked about that quite a bit around here at Woodland. But what Sandra, she did one simple thing that made me go, oh yeah, like it made sense, but it was like a aha made sense when she said, like, if you're in dialogue with someone and just that rises up, that's your elephant. And I'm like, right. Oh, that's what that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how easy, how stand at ready our elephant is to guide us in a way that's not super helpful.
Let's get out of here.
Yeah,
let's go get some peanuts.
Right. Let's vamoose. Chocolate covered ones, preferably.
Yeah, right.
Well, I think that we have some really interesting points to dive into, and we also have a question from the MuseCast email.
Cool.
So
all right.
We've got some things to volley back and forth today. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, awesome.
Hit me with it.
Well, one of the things I wanted to dive into first is this whole concept of an enemy. And I know that in my life, I'm sure I've done this. I'm pretty positive I've done it. But I also know that there are others who would say, I don't have an enemy. That's just not, there are people maybe I don't agree with, or maybe people I'm not as close to, but to call them an enemy is a little harsh. And so I think many times I don't know if it's looking for like the easy out or just, you know, the loophole in the scripture to say, but I don't really have enemies. So Dan, I'm wondering if you can help us. First of all, let's just talk about what does that mean to have an enemy? And then what is an example of when we make a group or a person our enemy? Let's like bring it home for people so they can't use the loophole.
Yeah. I don't know if I have a great answer for this. I think, because I probably fall into that same camp. I was like, I don't really think of like I have enemies. There are people that I don't understand, and there are people that bug me, but I wouldn't consider them my enemies. And like, if they wanted to come over for a coffee, I'd be like, yeah, sure, come on over, you know. But I do think that we can do behaviors that certainly separate ourselves from others, and sometimes that separation can grow into something a little more severe. And I think with politics, if you have to vote for one candidate over another, and I'm just pulling this out of my head right now.
That's all right.
I don't know. This
I like to
silly.
throw him curveballs.
Yeah, totally.
So.
Yeah. But I just feel like you notice, like I'm voting for whoever, whether it's Biden or Trump or somebody else maybe. Well, does that mean that you absolutely agree with everything that they say? I mean, that would be uncanny if you agreed with all of their positions on something. And yet, we don't say that I'm voting for these 17 positions. We say that we're voting for this figurehead. And what that does is that totally dumbs down and simplifies your vote and your perspective on all of these issues. And what that does is that creates a sharp category between me and them. Because most likely, the people who are voting for the other candidate that you're voting for, they probably agree with you on 7 or 8 items. But the fact that they're voting for the other candidate and I'm voting for this candidate, it creates this impression that they're on the other side. And if we understood the nuance below that, we would probably understand that, well, they're not as far on the other side as I thought, even though they're voting for the exact opposite candidate.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of subtle ways that we get nudged apart like that. And eventually, when our differences get exaggerated like that, we can view them as more different and more other than what they really are. Very subtle ways that this happens too is, you know, one of the popular mantras in our culture right now is to surround yourself with positive people.
Right.
And what that means is that you are now making a judgment, okay, that person's positive and I'm going to surround myself and I want to be around that person. And then part of this is you have to avoid negative people. And that person is negative, and I'm going to avoid them and see how I'm pulling these people in and I'm pushing those people away. And that becomes dangerous because most people who live under those mantras, they never really sit down and think, well, what exactly do I mean by positive and negative? And a lot of times it just ends up being people who are like me and people who are different than me. And those types of simplistic life principles can really kind of create these wedges between people. And, you know, I don't know if you'd call them enemies, but it's certainly, it can become an exponentially greater differentiation and otherness the more you live into those types of patterns.
Yeah, and I think where I have had to say, Shawna, cut it out, is because it's just what you said. It's when you begin to other someone or a people group or a part of society or whatever it is. It's those small nudges, like you said. And before long, if you're not dealing with these little nudges, then the chasm is huge. And then you have them over there and us over here, and it's an us versus them. And I think when we begin to think and act and speak in those ways, we're making enemies.
Yeah.
We wouldn't want to call it that because that's pretty harsh and we like to think better of ourselves, but that's the reality.
Yeah.
If I other you and keep pushing you away, then essentially I'm disassociating from you, I'm in division from you, and I'm making you an enemy.
Yep.
And so that is something that we need to be mindful of.
Yep.
And not just be mindful of, like actively try to come against those things. Now, we've said it a million times, that doesn't mean you put yourself in dangerous situation.
Right.
Like, please, no. But we can't be othering others and deeming people unworthy or whatever it is that we do.
Yeah, we're called to avoid sin.
Yeah.
Avoid sin, but not necessarily avoid sinners. I mean, Jesus surrounded himself with sinners. And if we had to avoid sinners, well, we would have to go on to a deserted island.
Yeah.
And even there, we would still find ourselves.
Yeah.
And so we would be,
How do you avoid yourself?
We can't avoid sinners.
Right.
And so definitely avoid sin, avoid danger, but not necessarily, you don't have to necessarily avoid sinners.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And just be in constant prayer about it, because I guarantee if you think about it, little examples will pop up and you'll be like, oh, great, I got to deal with that too. So yeah, you do. One of the things that Sandra said, and you mentioned it in your summary, was she talked about some practices that we could do to kind of help bring about that inner peace, which will in turn affect outer worldly peace. And one of the things she talked about was watching our news consumption, our media consumption, which I think is really important. And so I'm wondering, what principles or philosophies, Dan, do you implement to kind of guard your consumption of some of those things?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to say she was coming at Breaking Bad pretty ferociously.
Right.
And I kind of liked that series, and I kind of got sucked into it, and I was kind of cheering for Mr. White. And so I was kind of a little convicted on that. You know, it's funny because when that series first started, I wrote a blog post on how it's unnecessarily violent. And this is 5 episodes in. Talk about hypocrisy. Then I fell in love with the series. Okay,
you're like,
so
let's
I'm like,
delete,
this is bad. There's nothing redeeming about this. And then all of a sudden I'm just enraptured with it, and I can't stop watching it.
Market research.
Right. Yeah. So I could say market research the first time through, but the third time through,
when you're like,
probably not.
Yeah.
Right. I think it is really dangerous, and it's really great to have a spouse who we can talk about what we're watching together, and we can kind of process it. If you're not reflecting on what does this mean, do I agree with this, what do I think of what the character is doing, if you're not processing it in that way, then you're just kind of passively being affected by it. And so to be proactive viewers is my number one recommendation, is to interact with it and to question it and to prod it. And an example of this is like a lot of times the things that we see on TV are tactics to manipulate the viewer's emotions to set them up for payoffs, basically. And so there's something called a cat in the tree scene is what it's called, and that's where the protagonist rescues a cat in a tree. And what that does, or it does something like that, what that does is it allows the viewer to identify with the protagonist and say, I like this person. And you'll find that in a lot of shows. When you first get to know the character, they're doing something that you like so that you identify with them, so that when they are in danger, you feel threatened. And all of those things happen as a way to kind of manipulate us. And you see the same thing in Breaking Bad. You start off Breaking Bad, and his son is being picked on, and he has to step in and protect his son. And so that's like a cat in the tree scene where, protect your son like that. And in a lot of shows and movies, they'll, in order to show intimacy and to show connection and to show love, they will have a sex scene. Well, you don't actually have to watch the sex scene in order to get what the director is saying. And so, when we watch like rated R movies or something like that, they could be really good movies, but that doesn't mean we have to watch and gaze upon everything that the director is putting in front of us. And so a lot of times we'll just kind of mute it or turn off the sex scene. And, although what's really frustrating, and I don't want to talk too much about this, but what's really frustrating is when these characters are making love or whatever, and they're having this dialogue while they're doing this, and they're saying things that you need to know for the story. So then you got to turn the volume up, and then you have to listen to them, all of it, and it's just, I wish they wouldn't do that. If it's a love scene, fine, but don't put important dialogue in there that we're going to miss if we turn away from it. That's all an aside. But so those are some of the principles that I have.
Yeah.
Be proactive, and know that everything that is done in a show is meant to manipulate you, not in a bad way. It's meant to ultimately
make you feel something.
Yeah, make you feel something so that you have a payoff during the climax scene or whatever. And so just know that the director's job is to manipulate you, and to just be proactive and aware of that, and to make decisions about what you're going to consume. So that's me. What do you got for that?
Yeah, I would say just some very practical things along those lines. Like, if you feel like you have to watch something hidden, like away from everyone else, that's a telltale sign that you maybe should not tune in. I also, years ago, started the practice of being mindful of what I consume visually, or even read, like before I go to bed. Not to watch something super, violent, or I don't. Just so that my brain isn't you know,
because
vibing
you're
in the middle
asleep
of the night.
then, and you can't be proactive with it. It just festers
It's just
in your head.
there.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
so,
a good idea.
just being mindful of those things. And then, you know what, sometimes as simple as just turning it off and like focusing on something external. And by external, I mean, you know, like outside of the living room, the bedroom, the home, just so that you can just kind of come out of that, you know, not reality into a reality. And so, because I don't think we realize just how much, and Sandra did a really great job of talking about the hours upon hours that kids have grown up watching. Well, guess what? We were those kids, and now we're grown people. We're grown humans. And so that really does affect our inner peace.
Absolutely.
And if we're not peaceful in our innards, we can't be peaceful.
And our outards?
And our outers. Goofy Tuesday. Yeah, so those are just some very practical things. And I think the same is true for social media, like because that's another form of consumption. You just have to not let anything take captive of you. And you have to step back and just realize there's a different world, a whole
and that's
new world
tough
out
too,
there.
because social media with algorithms, they're designed to give you the things that have caused the most reaction, which is often the things that are designed to create a reaction. And so we're constantly being, you know, acted upon, and we're constantly having these reactions, and that's all sort of like strings that are just pulling us in directions.
We're being manipulated in a variety of ways.
The nice thing about Twitter is that you can turn the algorithm off, and you can just click on, so you just see the latest tweets, and instead of the things that you get spoon-fed. And I like that feature.
Me
and
too.
I wish Facebook would do that as well.
You know, in fact, whenever I'm scrolling Twitter, like you guys are getting like the nitty gritty here today. When I'm scrolling Twitter and I realize I'm seeing a bunch of things, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. Amen to that. I'm like, oh, hold on.
That's right.
This is all like the way Shawna thinks. Therefore, I need to switch it because I'm seeing the things that they have deemed I would like or I would agree with.
And you have to switch it every once in a
while.
while, because they'll switch it back on you.
They will.
And you have to,
Tricky.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about empathy, because I really think, and Sandra talked about this very well, that is a huge key to combating this whole, you are my enemy, you are the other thing, when you can empathize with another person. So, Dan, what do you think? Like, have you experienced a time in your life where empathy has caused you to change your view of a person or a situation? If you say no, that would be really bad. He's not empathetic.
Well, my problem is I have too many examples where I've experienced this, and not necessarily my empathy toward other people, but their empathy toward me is where I've felt like the most kind of convicted and softened, basically. And I've got so many examples of that, but one that just came up, a friend of mine, actually a follower on Twitter, they have transitioned, and they're now Natalie, and I knew Natalie on Twitter before the transition, and but this is like the closest person to me that I've known that has gone through this gender transition, and you know, the other people that I have known who have gone through this were in mental health, and so they were patients in the hospital, and they were in a very different life situation. And so my first exposure to transgender people were there, and some of them were very hostile, and they were very aggressive, and some of them were even violent, and just a real nastiness. And so I had this really bad attitude about transgender people because of my experience with them, and I don't really understand it, and I don't really know what I think about it. But Natalie, in some of the posts that she shared, was so vulnerable and so open about what she experienced when she made the decisions to begin transitioning. And there was such an honestness about it and such an authenticity about it that by itself really softened up. And when I've since had conversations with her, and she was on the podcast with Greg and I just about a week ago, and you can listen to her empathy, and you know, I would say things like, well, I don't really know what I think about this. I think that there's something that doesn't seem right about it. She was totally okay with that and saying, yeah, I understand, it is very different. And that type of, like, her understanding my confusion or my misunderstanding about it or whatever, that basically makes a conversation with that person safe.
Yeah.
It's no one's threatened. Nobody is trying to prove the other one wrong or anything like that. And what that does is that just now it allows for there to be dialogue. And when she has an empathetic attitude toward my lack of understanding, or even my doubt about her situation, and she's even open to that, man, we can have safe conversation now. And I think that's the power of empathy, is it creates safety so that we can dialogue, because we can't have peace, we can't be peacemakers if you can't even have dialogue.
No.
And so that's probably the most recent experience that I've had.
That's
How about
beautiful. Well, yeah, I've always, so if we take all these tests, right?
Yeah.
So, on one of them, like empathy is one of my top things.
Wow, cool.
So I actually have to be careful, because for me it can go, I can go down a tunnel of despair almost if I'm like empathizing with someone that's experienced trauma or pain. I have to be careful.
Yeah.
But what I have discovered, the importance of empathy, is that what it does is it causes you to see humans instead of situations. And Brian Stevenson, in his book, Just Mercy, talks about how each of us we are more than the worst thing we've ever done. And I think about that a lot when I'm dealing with people or engaging people, whether I'm in a relationship with them or they're just more peripheral in my life. I think of whatever it is that I have distaste for in them, or about their situation or life or whatever, beliefs or whatever it is. I tell myself they are more than this, and when I can enter into empathy, they become a human versus that issue or that stance or that belief or that action or whatever. And that just helps to engage human to human. It's not a magic elixir that's a cure-all, but it definitely helps, like you said, creates more of a safe space so that you can have dialogue. Because if you can't even have dialogue, I don't know how you move forward with any amount of peacemaking. If you can't even do that, it feels, maybe there is a way, I just don't know what it is. I haven't discovered it yet.
And what Sandra said, that if you lived in their shoes, you would do the same thing, and try to live into that, and start with that. Start with, even though I don't agree with what you're doing, or I don't understand what you're doing, given the shoes that I've been in and the walk that I've gone on, I know that if I were in your shoes, I would do what you're doing. So that now suddenly it's not me against you, it's me trying to figure out why you are doing what you're doing. And that's a much different perspective.
Absolutely.
That's great. So social media's got to be tough for you, being highly empathetic, because there's a lot of things to feel pain, and there's a lot of suffering there that you can sponge up when you're watching that.
Well, and that's why I've talked about in previous episodes and just in our conversations, is like there are times that I regularly practice logging off of social, because it gets to be too much. And then you begin to feel like there is no hope. And man, there is always hope in Jesus. And if I ever start to lose sight of that, that's when I know I've got to log off and engage in something else. So
that's good.
Well, we actually, Dan, we're almost out of time, but we did get a question emailed into us, and so this is your challenge.
Okay.
Megan sent us in a really good question, and you can follow up with her via email, but let's just really quickly introduce that, and then try to help her a little bit.
So Megan emailed us at newscast@gmail.com.
Yes.
So feel free to email in your questions. And she's in a situation.
Newscast@whchurch.org.
Yes.
Not gmail.com.
Oh gosh, I'm so embarrassed.
It's okay.
Megan emailed newscast@whchurch.org, and she's in the situation where she's been listening to Woodland Hills and listening to Greg's preaching and so forth, and has really sort of softened toward a lot of the theology here, but it's very different than the theology at her church. And she goes to, it doesn't matter, just goes to a different church, and she has just a different theology there, and she's feeling like she doesn't fit in there anymore, and she feels like she's not getting fed like she would like to be fed, and she just has suddenly has some disagreements with her church now. And so she wants to know what she should do, and unfortunately, email, we would need to know a lot more to give you exact advice on what to do. But I do have a verse, and I always wanted to be one of those people where anybody who came to you with a situation, you would come to them. let me show a verse to you. And I'm not there yet, but I do have a verse for this. So this is in Romans 14, verse 9. Oh, wait, no, that's not it. 14, 19, that's right. And Paul says this: "Let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification." Make every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification. So that's what I would recommend, is what can you do that will lead to peace and mutual edification. Now, it's possible that that you're both not being edified there, and maybe the only way that you can be edified is to go somewhere else. But unfortunately, that creates disunion, and so and that's why the Apostle Paul says, make every effort. It doesn't say you have to stay there. He just says, make every effort. Try your best to stay there, because really, you're in that community. And you're able to shape and to challenge their thoughts better than anybody else, because you have been with them and you have a relationship with them already. And so the Apostle Paul tells us to make every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification. And maybe that means just continuing to submit to their authority and having this different opinion and just continuing to challenge their perspective. Or maybe it means, especially as it relates to mutual edification, showing them how a different way of looking at these theological issues might make their faith better and might make the church better in various ways. And so I guess my answer is that's a good principle to base your decisions on, and any more specific guidance, I would need to know more about the situation. But that's my take on it. So,
well, thank you for sending in that question. And
indeed,
remember, you can send in questions, musecast@whchurch.org. Thank you for joining us. We really had a good time. We were a little goofy. Thank you for being here with our goofiness. To close out, we want to share, Dan has a scripture.
Oh, yes.
We want to share this as just a blessing to you all, and it's from Ephesians 3.
Yep, Ephesians 3, verses 16 to 19. "I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's people to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know that this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God."
Amen. Amen. Nothing can separate you from that love. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next week. Take care.